We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and study, the Whadjuk people of Noongar Boodja. We recognise their continuing connections to lands, waters and communities and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultures and to elders past and present. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history is deep, rich and spiritual, spanning more than 65,000 years, and is considered to be the oldest surviving culture in the world. Despite this, the detrimental impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal people, which began more than 250 years ago, are still being experienced today. Aboriginal people have long fought for acknowledgement of these injustices and an equal place in the Australian Constitution. The Uluru Statement of the Heart was born from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activism for substantive recognition in Australia's history. The statement is an invitation to the Australian people from First Nations Australians, asking them to walk together to build a better future. In 2017, the Referendum Council held a National First Nations Constitutional Convention at Uluru to ratify the decisions making of the regional dialogues. The convention delegates overwhelmingly endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its calls for voice, treaty, and truth in the path to reconciliation. Voice represents the national political representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In 2023, a public referendum on this matter was not carried, with 60% of the nation voting against the voice. The requests for treaty and truth are being addressed by the Makarrata Commission, named after the Yolngu concept of Makarrata, which captures the idea of two parties coming together after a struggle, healing divisions of the past. Australia remains the only Commonwealth country to have never signed a treaty with their First Nations people. The absence of a treaty after more than 250 years does nothing to assist with the hope of reconciliation. This presentation will focus on the truth-telling aspect of the statement, which aims to expose the extent of injustices that have been and continue to be experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia.
Truth-telling is a comprehensive process to expose the full extent of injustices experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to enable a shared understanding of Australia's colonial history and the contemporary impacts. Previously, Australian history has been predominated and told through colonial perspectives. This has contributed to racist ideologies and prejudice. Truth-telling isn't about assigning blame. However, it is about acknowledging that true reconciliation isn't possible without correctly understanding the shared history between colonials and both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. The implications of truth-telling are multifaceted. Firstly, truth-telling facilitates rethinking and change to Indigenous settler relations. Truth influences action, and therefore, redefining our truth as a nation may lead to the rethinking of systematic attitudes and racism, therefore improving Indigenous settler relations through a better understanding of Indigenous populations. Secondly, truth-telling will enable a new way of knowing and understanding who and what Australia is, redefining our nationhood. From colonisation, Indigenous peoples were subjected to white ways of thinking, knowing and doing. Despite attempts at reform, the absence of truth has resulted in the status quo being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having to live in a third space, an attempt at combining their Indigenous identity with the ways of the Western world. Rhonda Craven writes about this well in her book, Teaching Aboriginal Studies, that Indigenous people, specifically boys between the ages of 12 and 18, can be lost between worlds. Truth-telling can lead to a national identity where both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty, as well as sovereignty to the Crown, can both be acknowledged and can coexist equally. Finally, truth-telling allows us to understand and acknowledge why current racial inequities exist. The absence of truth-telling hides inequitable outcomes and their causes that are present due to social constructs, such as lower life expectancy or higher incarceration rates for Indigenous populations. These issues are a result of colonial history. Truth-telling will expose these issues and their systematic causes, such as the 1905 Aborigines Act, the removal of Aboriginal children from their families, local massacres, and various other social injustices. Exposing and exploring these truths is needed to be able to correctly address and resolve these ongoing inequities. Prior to the Uluru Statement, there have been some attempts at truth-telling, such as the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal children from their families. The Uluru Statement itself was a way of truth-telling through the local dialogues that were held and the consensus from Indigenous populations for a need to take action against current injustices. Work from the Uluru Statement has manifested in the form of state commissions for truth-telling. The Yurok Truth and Justice Commission, which was founded in Victoria in 2022, is the first of its kind, focusing on invasion and colonisation in Victoria. Other commissions in other states are in the process of being formed, specifically in the Northern Territory, Tasmania, and Queensland. However, until truth-telling is pervasive throughout Australia and Indigenously led, current injustices will persist and continue to impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations.
Jonah has just mentioned some positive examples of truth-telling in Australia's history. One of these in particular, the inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal children from their families and its subsequent Bringing Them Home report, had great socio-political significance in paving the way for greater action towards reconciliation. Whilst the John Howard government ignored the recommendations of the Bringing Them Home report and refused to formally apologise to the victims of the stolen generation, the subsequent Rudd government did not make the same mistake. 41 years after the 1967 referendum and 11 years after the Bringing Them Home report, Australia officially apologised to its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for past mistreatments. An extract of Kevin Rudd's speech read, "To deal now with what has become one of the darkest chapters in Australia's history. Until we fully confront that truth, there will always be a shadow hanging over us and our futures as a fully united and fully reconciled people. It is time to reconcile. It is time to recognise the injustices of the past. It is time to say sorry. It is time to move forward together." This apology was central to the healing process for Aboriginal Australians. It responded to the needs of the victims and their families for recognition of the misdeeds committed against them, and offered the perpetrators the opportunity to start making amends. The significance of this apology is captured by the words of Tom Calma, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the time, who responded, "Through one direct act, Parliament has acknowledged the existence and the impacts of the past policies and practices of forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families, and by doing so has paid respect to the stolen generations, for their suffering and their loss, for their resilience, and ultimately for their dignity." Despite the significance of Rudd's actions in putting reconciliation back on the government's agenda, there are examples of non-truth telling and non-truth listening that persist in Australia to date. Non-truth listening, according to Amber Lynn Quaymolina, is the things that Indigenous peoples have been saying for a really long time that have not been listened to. The problem seems to be that Australians know the truth, but actively choose to ignore it. For instance, it is well established that the 26th of January, 1788, was a dark day in Australian history, marking the beginning of a genocide against Indigenous Australia's peoples and culture. Despite this, many Australians insist on celebrating the day anyway. This date commemorates the establishment of British settlement on the continent and says nothing about the country we have become since, nor about the Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years. Similarly, the refusal to integrate the frontier wars into the Australian War Memorial serves as another example of Australian non-truth listening. The Australian War Memorial Act of 1980 contains a broad definition of the institution's role as a national memorial to Australians who have died as a result of any war and warlike operations. Under this definition, there should be ample coverage of the frontier warfare between settlers and First Nations people in the War Memorial. The creation of exhibits within this institution to acknowledge that Australia was built on invasion, dispossession, and violence, and to pay respects to the resistance fought by the Aboriginal population, would be a powerful act of truth-telling.
Truth-telling and truth-listening takes many forms. The power of scientific literature is often underappreciated. However, a strong presence in the literature leads to significant change. Evidence informs more than just healthcare practice. It informs policy, schemes, and initiatives that ultimately lead to improved outcomes. There has been a significant exponential increase in the scientific literature regarding health outcomes for Australian Aboriginal peoples as a whole. However, as compared to other ethnic groups, Aboriginal peoples are greatly underrepresented in the literature, particularly regarding qualitative Indigenous-owned and Indigenous co-designed research outputs. In saying this, the impact of truth-telling in the literature regarding Aboriginal peoples is growing. Truth-telling, represented by literature, often takes form as qualitative-based research, utilising interviews, focus groups, and phenomenological approaches to extract meaningful data and produce meaningful direction. However, we do also see truth-telling in the literature taking the form of research ownership, co-design, and co-led initiatives. Scientific research is starting to shift away from the Eurocentric view of research about a group to a more holistic stance of research for a group. While the act of publishing, utilising the scientific method, is Eurocentric in nature, the value of publishing and cementing Aboriginal and Indigenous knowledge systems within the broader scientific community as a form of truth-telling is immeasurable and provides a strong foundation for supporting and improving a large array of outcomes, including health-related outcomes. For example, a paper published by Smallwood and colleagues in 2022 utilised an Indigenous worldview approach to reviewing and further understanding young Aboriginal people's perspectives on healthcare within the Eurocentric healthcare system within Australia. This review also utilised a co-design method, where the method was guided by Aboriginal peoples in both an academic and non-academic setting. The results of the review strongly highlighted the importance of Aboriginal voice and truth-telling in understanding the holistic nature of health and well-being for Aboriginal peoples, which is further expanded on by the recent editorial by Tim Senior. A strong theme of this review was that young Aboriginal people did not speak to be listened to, but spoke to be heard, which demonstrates a changing narrative of Aboriginal healthcare within Australia, where the narrative is progressing to a strength-based approach. As truth-telling, co-design, ownership, and Indigenous scientific methodologies are being immortalised in the scientific community, this opens the door to reliable and culturally safe healthcare practices and policy making. I would like to, however, highlight that while there is a noticeable increase in Indigenous-led and owned research, where truth-telling is a strong current, the scientific model utilised globally is Eurocentric and colonial in nature. This paper, published back in 2007, unapologetically reminds us that science conducted in the past 200 years has been conducted in a manner that perpetuates colonialism and shifts away from Aboriginal epistemologies, and that Aboriginal epistemologies have been wrongly moulded into a manner that fits a colonial scientific method. In order for scientific research to truly reflect the voices of Aboriginal people, it must demonstrate a true benefit for Aboriginal peoples, which must be confirmed by Aboriginal elders of a country or representatives, which is often lacking in research. It leads us to question whether more research equates to more better.
Truth-telling is a practical necessity in achieving equitable healthcare for Indigenous Australians. It's important to acknowledge the presence of racism that is still embedded within our healthcare system. The lack of response by Australian institutions to Indigenous truth-telling has resulted in systemic biases and prejudices that influence the level of care Indigenous Australians face when seeking healthcare. The absence of truth-telling in all levels of our education systems exacerbates this issue and creates a disadvantaging cycle. Without a proper understanding of the true events Indigenous peoples have experienced and being told the white point of view of colonisation since primary school, healthcare professionals are ill-equipped to provide adequate care. The denial by Australian institutions towards the truth-telling of Indigenous dispossession and colonisation within the legal and policy frameworks further reduces our progress towards equitable care. Whilst there are documents, such as the 2021 Cultural Safety Position Statement by the Australian Medical Association, there is not enough focus on implementing the practices within healthcare settings, and there should be regular revision of these documents to incorporate more information as truth-telling is increasingly encouraged. So how can we place a path towards better health outcomes for Indigenous peoples through truth-telling? Firstly, it's vital for medical students to engage with open discussions with Indigenous communities and individuals to hear their lived experience and unlearn unconscious biases and racism. By listening and understanding past and present injustices faced by Indigenous peoples, such as disparities in care, we can begin to take a step towards addressing these issues. Additionally, it is crucial to increase Indigenous representation in medical settings. By recruiting and training Indigenous peoples, we can improve the level of truth-telling within healthcare settings and ensure culturally sensitive care. Standardised cultural training that is grounded in truth-telling can be introduced in all settings. This can allow medical professionals to lead by example, acknowledging the ongoing impact of the colonial past and striving to improve cultural safety in every interaction, hopefully improving the experience of Western health for Indigenous peoples. Finally, it's important, especially as future medical professionals, to listen, learn, and advocate for Indigenous peoples where their voices are not able to be heard. Advocating for truth-telling and change within our healthcare systems is vital to set towards equitable healthcare outcomes for Indigenous Australians. I would like to leave you to think about a quote spoken by Dr. Robin Barrington, a Yamaji scholar who emphasises healing through history. She describes that we all have a responsibility to tell the many untold stories of injustice and abuse against Aboriginal peoples across Australia that continue to ramify into our present.
Please take a few moments now to reflect on how you can practice truth-telling and truth-listening in your own life. Here are some examples provided by the Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. How many did you get? Can you think of any others?
The Uluru Statement of the Heart represents a monumental step towards reconciliation, recognition, and healing for Aboriginal peoples. At its core lies the imperative of truth-telling, acknowledging the painful truths of Australia's colonial past and the ongoing impacts of historical injustices on Aboriginal communities. By embracing truth-telling, we acknowledge the resilience, wisdom, and culture of Aboriginal people while also confronting the uncomfortable realities of our shared history. Through truth-telling, we can begin to dismantle the barriers of ignorance and denial, fostering understanding, empathy, and solidarity. The truth-telling aspect of the Uluru Statement highlights the importance of listening to Aboriginal people voices, respecting their sovereignty, and working together towards a future based on justice, equality, and reconciliation. It challenges us to confront the injustices of the past and actively engage in the process of healing and reconciliation. As we reflect on the Uluru Statement and its call for truth-telling, let us commit ourselves to the journey of reconciliation, understanding that it requires courage, humility, and a genuine commitment to justice for all Australians. Only through embracing truth-telling can we build a more inclusive and equitable society where the voices and rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are truly respected and upheld.